Hi everyone, it's Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is government finance and the economic outlook for the fiscal situation of our federal government. Now, that sounds really horrible and dry, right? But we're going to keep it simple. We don't need to know all of the nuances, but you as a taxpayer, a future taxpayer, and a voter needs to have a good understanding of this. And as we move on to talk about policy, it's going to be important for you to understand the economic climate. It's hard to weigh in on policy issues if you don't understand what our fiscal situation is. Let's get started. Our objectives for this particular lecture. First, we want to understand the very basics of government accounting. And I know I just said the word accounting and eyes roll when you think about accounting, for a lot of people at least, but we're talking about the basics. We're talking about revenues and expenditures, the two basic sides of the balance, right? So we want to get a sense of what kinds of government accounting do we need to look at. And that requires us to look first at revenues. What are the sources of revenue for the government? In other words, how does government get the money that they have to spend? And then we need to look at the other side of the story, and that's spending. And we divide government spending into two main categories. So what are the two main categories for government spending? So when we have revenue and government spending, then we can make some comparisons. But along the way, we want to get a sense of where are we spending the money? What are the biggest expenditures for our federal government? And that will be really illuminating, especially as we start to think later about reforming Social Security. From there, we can look at our fiscal situation, not just for today, but what do the trends seem to suggest? Where are we going? Are there any concerns as we think about the forecasts into the future? Because there are people, economists and actuarial scientists, who forecast these things into the future, who are able to show us graphical illustrations of what the world's going to look like for us in the United States, at least as we go forward, if we continue with this level of government spending, if we continue with this level of debt accumulation. So again, we're going to keep it pretty basic. Let's start with government revenues. Government revenues are the monies that come in to the government, and these are in the form of receipts. So this is money that people have to pay to government. So government revenues, the money coming in. How does government get the money that they have in the budgets to spend? We can look at a snapshot. This is at the date that I pulled it, how much revenue we've collected, and this is for fiscal year 2023, but I think we're actually at the end of that fiscal year. So as I record this, it should be just about the end of the fiscal year, if not already. Look at what this tells us. And this is such a big number, right? So you have to go from the left to the right and figure out, okay, you see thousands, and you see millions, then you see billions. Okay, this is trillions. What this tells us, 3,971,000,000. And I'm not going to worry about all those other numbers, and you don't need to write them down either. But you do need to indicate that $3.97 trillion. So that's almost $4 trillion. But this is revenue. This is revenue. Again, the money that comes in from the various sources, and this is what we use to pay the government expenses. So $3.97 trillion in revenue. Let's take a look at where this revenue comes from. Now, this is the previous fiscal year 2022, because that's what I was able to find at the time. And first question, what are the categories of this revenue? So in other words, I'm asking, what are the different sources of government revenue? Well, if we look at this graphic on the left, it lays it out for us. At the top, we see individual income taxes. So that's a big green portion, right? What are individual income taxes? These are the tax returns that I file, that your parents file, that if you're working or when you're working, you're going to be filing a tax return as well. And you're going to be paying taxes to the federal government. So individual income taxes. Then below that, we have payroll taxes. So what are payroll taxes? Well, we're going to be talking more about payroll taxes when we cover the basics of taxation, but payroll taxes are the taxes that the federal government is taking out of your check. So if you look at my paycheck, they're going to take a portion for Social Security. They're going to take a portion for Medicare, and they're going to take some other things. So by the time they take out these extra taxes, and guys, that's on top of just the tax I pay on my income. So by the time they take these payroll taxes out, I've paid income taxes, and then I've paid payroll taxes. And when I show this to you in a future lecture, you're going to be like, ouch, yeah, you end up having a big portion taken out of your check for taxes. All right, so we have individual income taxes. That's just the tax you're paying on your income. Then you've got payroll taxes, things that they're going to take out of your check for other things, Social Security, Medicare. All right, then we've got corporate income taxes. So those are the income taxes that are paid by businesses. And then we have the other category. The other category probably captures things like import tariffs. It might capture things like user fees, any federal licenses that have to be bought, but it's small potatoes, right? It's not a very big category. All right, so the word that we see over and over and over there, right? Taxes, taxes, taxes. So government revenue mostly comes from taxes, different kinds of taxes. So what is the biggest source of revenue? Well, if we look at this graphic, we see that the biggest chunk of the revenue comes from individual income taxes. So that tax return that you're going to have to file, that I file every year, your parents file, that's the biggest portion. And then it's followed up by payroll and then corporate. But the biggest, clearly the overwhelmingly largest component comes from individual income taxes. Now, that's worth a note here for a second, guys, because there's a lot of people that are calling for reductions in taxes, and I get that. But we have to remember, if we reduce income taxes, then we're reducing the revenue that our federal government has. And if we don't cut spending at the same time, then that means our deficits get larger and larger and our national debt gets larger and larger. So we have to be careful. We can advocate for individual income tax reform, but we do have to understand the implications and have a plan for how we're going to handle it when government revenues fall. Last question, is there much other than from taxes? And the answer is what? No. That other category is really tiny, and it's not really that consequential when it comes to giving government revenue to spend. So, taxes, 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 and more taxes. Let's now turn our attention to government expenditures. Now, please understand that we might use different language here. It might be government expenditures. It might be called government spending. It might be called government outlays. Those are all the same thing. So government expenditures, government spending, government outlays, these are the monies that go out in the form of expenses or payments. So these are the things that government is spending money on. So we have, again, capture the information for the fiscal year 2023, and that's going to allow us to compare to the government revenue. But what we see here, and again, counting from the right-hand side, you see the thousands and the millions and the billions. So this is in the trillions. We have 5,495,000,000. I'm going to ignore again all those little numbers. So this is almost $5.5 trillion, almost $5.5 trillion. So large government spending. The first thing that we should be asking is this a deficit or surplus for fiscal year 23? Deficit or surplus for fiscal year 23? Well, what do we need to know to answer that? We need to go back to the previous slide, right? And remember what revenue we raised in this year. So revenue, if you remember, was 3.97 trillion. All right, so guys, if revenue is 3.97 trillion and government spending is 5.49, almost 5.5 trillion, do we have a deficit or do we have a surplus in this year? Well, hopefully you're telling me deficit. So it should be obvious to you that we have a deficit. And how do we know that we have a deficit? Because our spending is higher than our revenue. If I asked you to calculate this, you could do that easily. So I'm getting out my calculator here. And we have government spending of 5.5 trillion. And I'm going to subtract off 3.97 trillion. So I'm doing that on my calculator, which gives us 1.53 trillion in deficit. So you should be able to look at numbers that I give you and tell me if we have a deficit or a surplus, and you should also be able to calculate the deficit. So the equation here is really simple: spending minus revenue. All right, let's continue. It turns out that we have two categories of government spending. It's important that we divide government spending into these two categories because they work differently in terms of the budgetary process. So it's important that we divide government spending into two categories. And the categories are like this. First, we have mandatory spending, and I'll explain that in just a minute, but our first category is mandatory spending. And then our second category is discretionary spending. So if we divide our government spending into two categories, we call it mandatory and discretionary spending. After that, we'll have to discuss one more type of expenditure, but let's put that off for right now. Let's start by talking about this first category of spending, which is the mandatory spending. The definition of mandatory spending is that this is primarily payments for benefit programs whose eligibility rules and benefit formulas are set by law. So let's get that into our notes. It's primarily payments for benefit programs whose eligibility rules and benefit formulas are set by law. So let's think about what that's saying. Mandatory spending is the law. There are laws that say people get these benefits. The laws tell us who's eligible for these benefits. There are formulas that are part of the law that say this is how we're going to calculate your benefits. So it's important to understand that mandatory spending is governed by the law. It's not optional. It's not up to Congress. It's the law. Again, with mandatory spending, we are locked into paying these because, as we've said, it's the law. So these aren't optional. Congress can't decide they just don't want to pay them. We can't get rid of them. And generally what we're talking about here in this category is what we call entitlement programs. Entitlement programs. And you need to understand what I mean when I say entitlement programs, because we will use that phrase again. So generally, we're talking about entitlement programs. What we mean is these are programs where there are rules for eligibility. There are rules for eligibility, and this is part of the law. So the law is saying these people are eligible for some kind of program, for some kind of benefit. So there's rules for eligibility. And so because of these rules in the law, people are entitled to these benefits. If you meet the rules for eligibility, then you're entitled to these benefits. And we can't just say, oh, we're not going to pay them, because they're mandatory. We're locked into paying them. It might also be a benefit that has accrued to individuals over time. Maybe it's a benefit that they're entitled to because they've accrued this benefit over time. And I'll give you a good example of that in just a second. But the bottom line here, guys, is that we have to pay these expenses, and that's why we call them mandatory spending. What are some examples of mandatory expenses, of entitlement programs like this? Well, a good example is Social Security and Medicare for retirees. Remember, we'll talk more about Social Security, but Social Security is those payments to retirees at a certain age. They become eligible. And then they're also eligible to participate in Medicare, which is a health care program for retirees. Now, guys, this is an example of what I mean when I say that there are benefits that have accrued to individuals over time, because they're going to take Social Security taxes out of your check, and you're entitled to get payments upon retirement. So this is an entitlement program. There are rules for eligibility. For example, you have to be a certain age before you can collect Social Security, but it's part of the law, and Congress can't say, you know what, we're just going to scrap Social Security. We'll talk more about Social Security later. But another example is Medicaid, health care for low-income people. Well, we want to make sure people have health care, and so we have programs to help those people that are the lowest income. And again, it's a mandatory expenditure. There are rules for eligibility. They're income-based, and they tell us who gets Medicaid and who doesn't. But these rules exist, and based on the current rules, we have to deliver these services and these benefits. Now, many people don't like the term entitlement program. It possibly sounds derogatory or elitist. One place where people really have a problem with it is Social Security, because people are arguing, hey, look, don't make it sound like this is something negative, that, somehow I am getting something I don't deserve. People argue that they pay into Social Security. If you look at my paycheck, they take 7.65% tax out of my check for Social Security. So is it that you're just kind of hooking me up with retirement benefits later, or is it that you've made me pay for them now and I'm entitled to them in the future? Again, I don't think the term is intended to be derogatory, but some people feel like they're being treated like somehow they're acting entitled, when in fact there is a tax, as I said, 7.65% tax on labor income that's taken out of your check, and people are simply saying they expect to be paid back for this, which makes sense. And so when people call it an entitlement program, you'll see that people get a little mad about that. But we do call them entitlement programs, and I'm going to call them entitlement programs, but you can understand where I'm coming from when I say that it just kind of sounds really negative, right? It has a negative connotation. Understand here, folks, that Congress does not get to choose to pay or not to pay, right? This is not something that's in the domain of Congress to make choices about paying or not paying. In other words, what this means, and this is an important point, the costs of these mandatory spending programs are somewhat external to the political process. They are somewhat external to the political process, because remember, there's laws that govern who gets what. And so Congress has to just follow the law. Social Security, again, is a good example. Our expense associated with the Social Security program is based on the number of retirees, right? If there are more retirees, we have more Social Security expense. Now, guys, can Congress just say, wow, we're getting too many old people, we need to stop paying this? No, they can't, right? Because it's a mandatory program. So Social Security, Congress can't necessarily contain the costs of that program because it's driven by the number of retirees. And that's important to understand. It's driven by how many people are eligible. So there are rules for eligibility. Now, government can have a little influence because government can change the rules just a bit. They can refine those eligibility rules. And when they refine those eligibility rules, it does influence the expense. How much money do we have to pay? But Congress can't just scrap it. For example, if you look over time, you'll see that we increased the age for full benefits on Social Security. So it used to be 65 and we raised it to 67. This was a cost-saving mechanism. So we can change the rules a little bit, but what we can't do is say, yeah, people that are 50 or so, we're not going to give you Social Security. So you need to just start really saving aggressively. They can't do that because you've been taxed, or rather me, I've been taxed, and I'm entitled to this money back in the form of some payment later. But as I said, Congress can make some changes at the margin by changing eligibility just a little bit, and when they do that, we might be able to save a little money. So should we bail out Social Security by raising the eligibility age to 69? Well, we could. We'll talk about those kinds of things later. Probably that would make a lot of people unhappy, but Congress does have the ability to make some changes in the rules. But be clear, guys, when we're thinking about something like Social Security, the number of elderly people is the most important variable, right? How many elderly people do we need to support with our Social Security program? So I want you to be clear, and this is really important, guys. This means that Congress can't really control how much money has to go out the door, right? And that's important to understand. The rules say you're eligible and that this is how much you're going to get, and this is the total cost of running the program. And so Congress doesn't have a lot of opportunities to contain those costs. And that's important to understand. It will be very relevant when we start looking at data. Well, let's think for a second. What is happening to our elderly population in the United States? I'm guessing you already know, right? Think about those baby boomers who've reached retirement age, and what are we seeing now? So, right here, this is partly a forecast, right? So the first thing, guys, when you have graphs, you got to look at the axes before you do anything. So let's look at the horizontal axes. We're looking at our predictions for seniors is what we care about. So we're going to look at the lighter blue line. And we're forecasting over time, right? We have some data from, looks like 2016 or so, and we're forecasting all the way to 2060. Now, guys, are there people that know how to forecast demographics? Of course there are. There are people whose job it is to forecast the demographics of our population. Then, on the vertical axis, we're looking at the number of millions of people that fall into these categories. All right. So let's look at that light blue line and ask the question, what is happening to our older population? Well, everyone agree that our older population is getting much bigger, right? Over time, this baby boomers are becoming retirees and people are living longer. So as baby boomers retire and now people are living longer, wow, what does that mean? We have a lot of people we have to support with Social Security. So let's think about that. How does this impact our mandatory spending, given that we know Social Security and Medicare, right, payments and health care for retirees is part of that? Well, this probably suggests to us that mandatory spending is going to start really ballooning, right? because we can't just make people ineligible. We can't just tell them they can't have these benefits. It's mandatory spending. These are entitlement programs. We're going to have the money for this, folks, right? And the last question, is there an end in sight? Well, this is forecasted out to 2060. Now, in 2060, I might be already dead, but you'll be in your working prime. So if there's not an end in sight here, somebody's going to have to pay to make sure that these people get their benefits. But more on Social Security later. But I want you to see what I mean about that it's hard to contain the costs for mandatory spending because it's not up to Congress and it's driven by who is eligible. And so over 65 with partial benefits, 67 for full benefits, yeah, this is going to get expensive. Let's take a look at our mandatory spending. So again, always read the heading so you know what we're working with. This is 2023 mandatory outlays, okay? And it's actually reported in billions, so don't let that confuse you. 3,980 billion is the same thing as 3.98 trillion. All right, let's look at this pie chart, and we see two really big chunks of the pie. On the right, we have major healthcare programs, and that's going to include that Medicare for retirees, so healthcare entitlement programs. And on the left, we have Social Security, and that's the cash payments for retirees, but it's also going to include some other things. So guys, look at what's going on. We've got two red arrows pointing to two pieces of the pie, and these are a bulk of it going to retirees. And that's a population that's getting larger. So that's a problem, right? You see where we're going with this? We're going to see ballooning expenses related to these two types of entitlement programs. And since they're mandatory outlays, there's not a lot we can do to try to rein this in, only some things. Let's move on to talk about the second category of spending. Remember, the first category was mandatory expenditures, right? Things that are governed by laws and eligibility rules. People might have accrued benefits that then have to be given to them. But the second category is discretionary. So my guess is that you have some general sense of what this is going to be, right? Because mandatory is the opposite of discretionary. What we're talking about here with discretionary is spending that lawmakers control through annual appropriation acts. Spending that lawmakers control through annual appropriation acts. Spending that lawmakers control through annual appropriation acts. All right, so two things should jump out there in that definition. First, it says lawmakers control. So here's the thing that Congress does get to control when it comes to government spending. And the second thing that should jump out at you is annual appropriations. So this is an annual budgetary process. And I'm sure you're aware that every year Congress has to set the budget. Same thing is true for states. Longwood University is always waiting to find out what the legislature sets as their annual budget. Well, this is what's going on at the federal level as well. In other words, with discretionary spending, Congress is making the decision about this. They can't control mandatory expenditures in the same way, but they do control discretionary spending. We just said there's a budgetary process each year. So every year there's a budget process, and those federal government agencies have to wait to learn their budget. So nobody knows what their budget's going to be until Congress tells them what it's going to be. For example, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, they want to know what are they going to receive for this fiscal year. Well, they don't know until Congress tells them, right? But here's something interesting. We have a law on the books, and that law says agencies cannot spend without a budget being passed. Let's look at that again. So there's a law on our books. We have a federal law that says agencies cannot spend without a budget being passed. Now I'm keeping the language simple, but think about the implication of this, that agencies cannot spend without a budget being passed. So when there's no budget passed, and sometimes that happens, right? When there's no budget passed, then there's no money. So think about what's going to happen when there's this political fighting about the budget and they don't pass a budget, which means now there's no money and agencies can't spend anything until the budget is reconciled. So when Congress can't agree, and this has happened, where Congress cannot agree on a budget, when they cannot agree, they risk a government shutdown. And there have been a number of government shutdowns that I can remember. So if Congress can't agree on a budget, if they're fighting and maybe the Democrats and the Republicans aren't seeing eye to eye and one side wants concessions and the other's refusing to make concessions and they cannot negotiate an agreed upon budget, then we're going to likely have a government shutdown. And here's the problem. If we have a government shutdown, then we cannot pay the workers, and government agencies cannot buy things. So guys, if you can't pay your workers and you cannot buy things, then you're shutting down. But understand, these government shutdowns are not about mandatory expenditures, right? These are about discretionary. So remember, this government shutdown process is related to not being able to agree on a budget. So it's not about mandatory expenditures because those are locked in. That is not part of the annual budgetary process. So it's the discretionary expenditures that are causing government shutdowns, when they just cannot agree on a budget that governs the discretionary expenditures. Let's take a look at discretionary expenditures. So I found this data for 2023. All of these sectors, first of all, understand, would shut down to some degree if a budget is not passed. Unless, as the second part in that yellow box said, they are deemed as critical functions. Now, defense. We're not going to tell all of our soldiers to go home because we can't pay them right now. They are deemed a critical function, but we might not be able to pay them right away. Transportation, health, education, all these things could shut down, or people might have to work, but they can't get paid until the government reconciles the budget. So what makes up the largest share of discretionary spending? Well, it's defense, right? Doesn't quite make up half, but it comes fairly close to being half of the discretionary outlays. So Congress has to agree on a defense budget, and maybe that's going to cause some political strife and tension between the two parties. Maybe they don't agree philosophically on how much we should spend on defense. But then all those other colors of pieces of the pie, it's a little hard to kind of match them up, but they're small compared to defense. So defense is our largest discretionary spending. Now guys, a lot of people get confused because they think that defense is mandatory spending. I mean, we have to have defense, right? Well, no, we don't have to have defense. It is a discretionary spending. In fact, if you look at Costa Rica, they eliminated their military and freed up all that money for other discretionary spending. Not suggesting we should be doing that, but do understand that defense is a discretionary expenditure. So at this point, we have talked about our two different types of spending. let's recap. We've got mandatory spending and discretionary spending. We understand that mandatory are things where they are governed by eligibility rules. There are formulas. This is law, so we have to pay those. Discretionary spending, on the other hand, is controlled by Congress, and the lawmakers have to get together and make a decision about the budget every year, and the budget they're deciding upon is those discretionary expenditures. There's one more expense, though, that's really important that we're going to have to go through, but we are going to save that for part 2 of this lecture. So thanks for listening, guys. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a fantastic day.